Coming to paperback and e-readers, Isis Dark Incubus. The goddess next door gets enthralled in a romantic entanglement with an evil incubus in this all-new Isis series adventure. Pre-order your copy of Isis Dark Incubus at Amazon.com and other online booksellers everywhere. Why aren't people buying Marvel and DC comics? And the answer to that question is very simple. Most people aren't buying Marvel or DC comics because Marvel and DC comics just aren't fun anymore. Now, Marvel and DC represent the big two as related to comic publishers, and they used to control a majority of the market as related to American comic books. And Marvel and DC's sales of superhero comics basically drove a lot of the business of modern comic books, but over the last couple of years, people haven't had incentive to go out and buy American comics because Marvel and DC comics just aren't fun anymore. And the main reason why Marvel and DC comics just aren't fun anymore has to do with the editorial at Marvel and DC Comics not really understanding the business of comic books. Now, when it comes to comic books, such as superhero comics are supposed to have action and adventure, and as they have action and adventure, the job of that comic is to give a reader an escape, and as they're getting that escape from their troubles in the real world, they are given some sort of hope and possibly a solution to some of their life's problems that they see that they can relate to in the pages of that comic. Unfortunately, many of those who are outside of the comic book industry came into the business with no real publishing experience, and these people came into editorial, and as they came into editorial, all they were looking to do was try to commodify these characters and not really go out and tell stories the way legendary comic creators used to. Now, old school comic creators oftentimes wanted to tell stories with these characters that were organic from the source material, and as they wanted to tell stories, they wanted to tell stories that were featuring action and adventure and something that was filled with a lot of hope and optimism. Unfortunately, as we went into the late 80s, into the 90s, we had a major shift with editorial, and that shift with editorial came correlated with a speculator boom, where a lot of people were out here buying comics not because they enjoyed comics or the characters, but because they were hoping to make an investment for the future. Now, these people who wanted to commodify comics, what they did was start to suck the fun out of the hobby because they were not really interested in the stories. No, they were interested in trying to create a bubble so that they could see a way to make a fast dollar through commodifying comics. And what we got was the speculator boom, where we had individuals who were buying comics based on artificial events that were created just to try to go out here and get sales from speculators. And examples of this were stories like the death of Superman, Nightfall, which replaced Batman with Azrael, and the Clone Saga. All of these stories were so-called events that were oftentimes sold in things like variant covers, things like hologram editions or foil stamped edition covers. These were things that were meant to try to incentivize all of those speculators, but really did damage to the overall model of storytelling for comics, which used to be fun and used to be something that got people excited and anticipating buying the next issue, whether they bought a back issue or whether they bought the current issue that was on the newsstand. And people really were excited about comics back in the late 80s, and when I first got into comics, regularly buying new comics because I used to read the old comics in my brother's collection, but people were getting excited once again for comics because the stories were great, and they were anticipating picking up the next issue of comics primarily based on the stories because the stories were so much fun. And there were lots of great stories going on in the late 80s, like the Iron Man Armor Wars, Captain America No More, the Todd McFarlane Spider-Man run, or other books like Wally West, Flash starting to get Mark Waid on the book, and books like Batman were red hot, and the X-Men were red hot, not to mention the Dale Quan Hulk. I mean, just so many great books were out there, and the stories were absolutely fantastic because the writers had passion and heart as related to the stories they were telling. But all of that started to change in the 1990s when the business started to creep in and people wanted to commodify the Marvel and DC characters. And as they commodified these characters, looking to try to manipulate people into buying books on speculation and not love of the stories, this basically was what made it where comics stopped being fun for readers, and instead of writing stories that would have just shown different aspects of the characters that made them great, it became about pandering to these speculators, and pandering to the speculator by making some sort of gimmick event happen that would get people excited about the event, but not the character or their stories. And this whole process, combined with the plans for companies like Marvel to change the distribution model, basically did the damage to the overall craft of comics. And the craft of comics has basically suffered ever since, because as Marvel's seasoned editors and DC's seasoned editors began to leave, the overall joy of comics left because the editors just didn't have that passion anymore for the characters or the stories. And because these editors didn't have the passion, what happened was we didn't get that passion on the page, because since the editor didn't have the passion, they weren't looking to hire people with that passion for comics overall. Now, what's happening over at Marvel and DC is the fact that you have people in these positions of editorial who really never had a passion for comics, and because they don't have a passion for comics, they go out and hire writers with no passion for comics. And when you hire writers and artists with no passion for comics, you don't get that care for the characters, you don't get that care for the stories, you don't get that care for what's put on the page. And that's the main reason why people just don't want to buy comics, because if the people in creative don't care, then the customer has no reason to care at all. Because if you're getting a book that's just completely uninspired, with no love or heart or passion for what's on the page, then why should a customer go out here and buy that comic? That's the critical question I have to ask as related to many of these people who are currently in charge of comics for the last 25 to 30 years. What we've had in comics for the last 25 or 30 years are people who have no love for the characters, no love for the stories, no love for the medium. They're just coming here thinking that they can create a covert contract that will take them to Hollywood because they've seen the success of all of these superhero movies, and they're thinking that they can go out here and put a rocket on their back by making a comic that will take them over to Hollywood. However, that was never the case when it came to comic book characters. No, when it came to comic book characters, especially superheroes, they were never on that road. But these days, we have a lot of creators who want to go to that road and don't want to go through the whole process of dealing with Hollywood as related to agents and having to try to sell a screenplay. So they would rather try to sell a comic and then have that comic be sold as related to film and TV rights. But that's something that rarely ever happens. But you've got people in this business who really, again, don't have a love for comics, don't have a love for the characters, don't have a love for the stories, and this has made it where just looking at a Marvel or DC comic is a very miserable experience in contrast to what we had in the 80s. Now, in the 80s and the 70s, when my brother was collecting comics were very exciting and a lot of fun. I mean, comics were just a blast to read, and you couldn't wait to pick up the next issue because the books were just that much fun. But as we've gone on from the 90s to the 2000s to the 2010s, the passion is no longer on the page, and with there being no passion on the page of Marvel and DC comics, the industry has suffered. Now, the industry has suffered because Marvel and DC are basically the backbone of the industry. They are the reason why we do get the books out here as related to the overall marketplace, because when people go to buy Marvel and DC, they also go to buy independent comics as well, because they were all sold together. Now, these comics were sold together originally in the 80s in places like bodegas, like supermarkets, like stores and drugstores and toy stores, and all of these places. Comics were sold regularly at these places until Marvel decided to buy Heroes World and change the entire distribution model. And as Marvel tried to go into distribution for itself, it went into bankruptcy, and this basically destroyed the entire distribution model, leaving us only with comic shops in charge, because the only market left was the direct market. Now, we were only left with the direct market because the comics companies like Marvel and DC didn't want to deal with retailers and returns, because in publishing, you have to, if you do go to a retailer, you have to give them returns, and if books are not sold by a certain time, you have to return them for credit. But the companies wanted to deal with the direct market because there was no returnability, and this basically, as the speculative boom crashed and Marvel went into bankruptcy, shrank the market. And as it shrank the market, Marvel and DC could only be sold in comic shops, and comic fans did follow them there, but they lost the large casual audience. And as they lost the large casual audience to the direct market's smaller audience, what we've seen is a lot of the people who had passion for comics, yes, it became a more consolidated group at the comic shops. But what's happened now is, because the books have grown to be so bad ever since about 2001, the market has started to contract to the point where the comic shops can no longer stay in business, because the books are not ones that excite people and get them incentivized to go out here and buy comics. And that is fueled by editorial constantly trying to go out here and trying to follow dysfunctional story models like shock and awe, or in the case of DC, trying to reset its continuity every couple of years. This has made comics very frustrating for the average reader, and it's made it frustrating to the point where people just don't want to buy comics anymore at Marvel and DC, because everything is so confusing at this point, with in between these universe reboots that basically take a reader out of a story they were getting into, or these, at Marvel, these reboots of a series which you are starting to follow this book, and then eventually what they do is, even if the book is good, like a Daredevil or a Moon Knight, they cancel the book, and then you have to start completely over again. And all of this has sucked the fun and the joy out of buying comics, because you have to sit there and walk on eggshells, wondering if the book that you're buying is still going to wind up in print, and wondering if you can find a place to buy that book these days, because a lot of the comic shops you go to are always winded up going out of business. I mean, here in New York, we lost Jim Hanley's Universe, a comic shop that had been in business for almost 30 years, and we lost other comics like Village Comics in the Village. I mean, a shop I used to go to back in the late 80s with my brother, and I bought many books, including Todd McFarlane run books, Spider-Man, and I bought a Captain Britain trade paperback. I mean, I bought a lot of great books at Village Comics, and all those comic shops, which were icons in neighborhoods like Greenwich Village and in Herald Square, where Jim Hanley's used to be, these were major places where folks used to go get their comics. But those businesses were put out of business because Marvel and DC don't produce fun comics anymore, and they don't produce comics with fun, accessible stories that people can just go out here, pick up, and enjoy. So people don't have incentive to buy comics because they're not fun anymore. I mean, most comics these days are filled with these very dreary, depressing stories that follow an archaic, deconstructed story model, and they don't really give the reader hope. And if you don't give the reader hope, then the reader doesn't have a reason to care. And that's what's really hurting the overall business at Marvel and DC. And this is trickling down to many of the independent publishers who do get into stores. Their sales suffer because most people are looking for their Marvel and DC superhero fix. And after they get their superhero fix, they will head over and go buy books from companies like Dynamite, where they have a lot of the Bad Girl comics, or they'll go to Dark Horse and buy many of the independent comics, or Image and buy some of the more unique concepts. They will go out here and buy these books from these smaller independent companies, and that has been the business model for comics for the last 40 years. But sadly, that business has gone into a major state of decline because, again, editorial at Marvel and DC is a complete mess. And because it's a complete mess, it's just not fun anymore. I mean, over at DC, you have a lot of inexperienced people ever since Dan Didio took over in 2002. And when he left in about 2020 or so, more inexperienced people took over as editorial. And DC is a jumbled mess as related to its editorial because the continuity has been rebooted about 5-6 times, and nobody really has a sense of direction over at DC. And that makes those books hard to read and hard to access, and even harder to access than the time when we had 3 different Earths in pre-crisis DC, and the books are just as even more hopeless than they were during the early 80s when DC was in a major sales slump. Now, over at Marvel, we've had a lot of these inexperienced people calling themselves trying to make comics political and pushing their social justice and identity politics narratives. And many of these people really don't have an understanding of how to go out here and create a good story. No, they don't even care about the characters. It's all about their agenda. And because it's all about their agenda, they basically suck the fun out of any story that they do. And most of their books, again, are a jumbled mess as well. So most of these people have no good sense of the characters, no good sense of the story, and there's no real passion on the page for telling superhero stories that are filled with fun, action, and adventure. And since there's no fun or joy on the page or anything to stimulate you emotionally, to excite you, this is why people aren't buying Marvel and DC comics, and it's doing major damage to this business, to the point where people just are not interested in buying comics anymore if they can find them. Because if they try to find a comic shop, again, it's hard to find with so many closing, and many are closing because the books just aren't fun anymore. I mean, I've heard of people who used to have $200-$300 a week pull lists basically wind up pulling out of comics. These were people who were dropping $200-$300 a week just on comics alone, and combine that with the action figures they used to buy, and a lot of these people would go easily in a month spending $1,000 in a comic shop. And those comic shops did very well as related to collectibles. They did very well as related to the comics, old comics, new comics. They used to make good money, but these days those guys aren't making any money, because what most people do come in, if they're looking for comics these days, they're looking for old comics, or they're looking for trade paperbacks that they can get at Barnes & Noble and Amazon. But the shop's money is mainly made on new comics, because new comics drive the sales of the newer comic and the older comic as well. It's the comic that's currently on the shelf that sells the back issues in the back issue section and drives their demand up, because the supply becomes limited once the book goes out of print. And it also drives the sale of the new comic that comes out next month. But when you have inept creative in charge and inept editorial leading them, what this does is it derails the train as related to sales. And those sales are primarily driven by how fun and exciting those books are. So comics need to be fun in order to sell, and they need to be something that people can look forward to escaping to from their job, from their personal life, something that can give them a smile on their face. That's what comics need to be in order to sell, and that's what a comic needs to be in order to get people excited about buying them and excited about looking forward to that next book coming every month. That's what a comic is supposed to be. But because comics aren't fun anymore, people really are not eager to go out here and buy comics about guys like Spider-Man, having his wife be in the arms of another man and having children with another man, Tony Stark being a beta male who just doesn't know what he wants to do with his life, or watching people like Bruce Wayne wind up losing his fortune and losing his hand. These are not things that get people excited to buy comics. No, this is what gets people to walk away from comics, because people already have enough misery in their lives, and nobody wants to sit there and be miserable and sit there and read about a miserable character. No, people read books to get away from their misery, because if they wanted misery, they can just go watch the 6 o'clock news or the 10 o'clock news or the 11 o'clock news, or just look out their window. But people, when they buy comics to read books that are fun. They want to smile, they want to laugh, they want to get that moment where they can say, hey, this is a break from my life. That's why people buy comics. And until comics are fun again, the industry will continue to contract. And sadly, since we don't have editors with that love and passion for comics, we are in a bad place, because, again, Marvel and DC may make superhero comics, but the whole thing is the market is contracted to the point where they only have 9% of the market, and people have decided to move on to other forms of comic storytelling and comic mediums like manga and independent comics, because from crowdfunding projects, because they want that escape. They want that escape, and if they can't get it from the big comic publishers, they will get it someplace else. And what's really sad is all of those comic shop owners, they are the ones who take the big losses, because they wanted to bring fun to readers, and now they're miserable as related to their business, because these comic companies won't give them the product that they need to stay in business. And that's the whole sad part about this whole business, is American comic shop owners, they weren't guilty of anything except trying to continue enjoying comics and enjoying comic stories and sharing them. And the publishers are the ones who are continuing to try to make these terrible comics, and these terrible comics are basically killing the American comic book business. Now, my first full comic, John Haynes at Death's Door, is available on Lulu.com right now, and you can pick up a paper copy on Lulu for the same price as it was on the 2022 Kickstarter by clicking the link in the description box. And my first comic that I did digitally with Bill Walko, A Steam No Good Deed, is available on Kindle for 99 cents, and you can get your copy of No Good Deed for 99 cents, a fun comic. And you can also find that comic in paperback in a Steam Blast from the Past on Amazon.com in paperback. And I want to get my second full fun comic out, and this was going to be one featuring the goddess next door, Isis, and I'm planning a fun comic for that next comic, but I can only make that comic with your help. So if you guys could drop a donation to the Cash App, that would help me in continuing to try to raise the funds to pay the artist to be able to help finish this comic. I've got 2 scripts already written for an ISIS comic book, and I would love to get that out sooner rather than later. And in order to do that, I would need your help. So if you guys could drop a donation to the Cash App or the PayPal, that would help me to be able to bring more fun comics to you. And I want to bring more fun to comics, because the only way we can get this industry straight is if comics are fun again. And I believe we really do need to get comics back to being fun and stop focusing on minutia like over-excessive obsession with continuity, gimmick storytelling, and other bad habits people learned in the 1990s and the 2000s. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Coming to paperback and e-readers, John Haynes, Illuminati. The man who rules the world takes on the head of the global elite in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes series adventure. Pre-order your copy of John Haynes, Illuminati on Amazon.com and online booksellers everywhere. Now available on Lulu. John Haynes at Death's Door. The man who rules the world takes on the Greek god of death in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes comic book. Get your copy of the first John Haynes comic at Lulu.com today. Support Black-owned and Black-operated digital broadcast media. www.niceradionetwork.com. Nice Radio Network, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.